As those words left the president's mouth, the temperature of the entire nation seemed to shift, because this was no longer just a missing person investigation quietly unfolding in the background of daily headlines. It became a thunderous warning delivered from the highest level of power, a declaration that if the alleged kidnappers of 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie did not return her unharmed, they could face the most severe punishment under federal law, including the death penalty. And in that instant, the case transformed from a tense search operation into a moral confrontation between justice and brutality, authority and defiance, hope and fear. What makes this moment so electrifying is not only the severity of the language, but the timing. An elderly woman missing, a family publicly pleading for her safe return, surveillance footage circulating of a masked individual near her home, investigators working methodically behind the scenes, and then suddenly a statement so forceful that it reframes the stakes entirely, signaling to anyone responsible that the consequences will not merely be legal, but historic. Behind the bold rhetoric lies a layered reality, because when a sitting president publicly references capital punishment in an active case, it sends multiple messages at once. To the suspects, it signals zero tolerance. To the public, it demonstrates urgency. To law enforcement, it underscores political support for aggressive prosecution. And to the broader legal system, it introduces complex conversations about jurisdiction, due process, and evidentiary thresholds. This is not a casual remark. It is strategic language that shapes perception, intensifies pressure, and elevates the case beyond local investigation into the realm of national attention. The disappearance of Nancy Guthrie had already gripped communities with concern, but now it carried the weight of federal consequence, and that shift matters because perception can influence behavior, and behavior can influence outcomes. At the heart of this unfolding drama is an 84-year-old woman whose vulnerability amplifies the emotional gravity of every update, every statement, every whispered theory. When someone of advanced age vanishes under suspicious circumstances, the public instinctively reacts with protectiveness and urgency, and the president's words tap directly into that instinct, reinforcing a collective demand for accountability while also raising the emotional intensity of the narrative. It is one thing to search for answers. It is another to declare in advance that if harm is proven, the punishment will be absolute. That distinction turns investigation into warning, and warning into national resolve. Yet seasoned observers understand that rhetoric and reality operate on different timelines. While strong statements capture headlines and stir public reaction, the legal pathway toward pursuing the death penalty is complex, deliberate, and heavily regulated. It requires incontrovertible evidence, formal charges, prosecutorial review, and judicial oversight, steps that cannot be rushed by emotion alone. And so, beneath the dramatic tone of the announcement lies the disciplined machinery of the justice system, moving carefully, methodically, and with precision. The contrast between fiery public declaration and measured legal process creates a tension that defines this moment in the case. But there is also a psychological dimension to consider. Publicly invoking the harshest possible consequence can serve as leverage, a signal intended to pressure those responsible into reconsidering their actions. In kidnapping cases, time is critical, and strategic messaging can sometimes influence outcomes. The president's statement may not simply be about punishment after the fact. It may also be about deterrence in the present, an attempt to increase the perceived cost of further harm. Whether that strategy proves effective remains uncertain, but the intent behind such forceful language cannot be ignored. Meanwhile, investigators continue their work beyond the spotlight, analyzing evidence, reviewing surveillance footage, interviewing potential witnesses, and reconstructing timelines with painstaking accuracy. The political declaration does not replace forensic science or procedural rigor. Instead, it overlays the investigation with a heightened sense of national expectation. Every lab result, every confirmed detail, every official update now carries amplified weight, because the narrative has been elevated from local tragedy to federal consequence. The case is no longer unfolding quietly. It is unfolding under the glare of history. And perhaps that is the most profound element of this moment. Not merely the mention of the death penalty, but the reflection of how deeply this disappearance has resonated. When leadership speaks in absolutes, it mirrors the public's demand for clarity and justice, yet it also reminds us of the delicate balance between emotion and law, urgency and due process. In my view, while the severity of the statement underscores the seriousness of the case, the ultimate measure of justice will depend not on rhetoric, but on evidence, truth, and careful legal process. And as this story continues to unfold, unfold, the nation watches not only for resolution, but for reassurance that justice, however defined, will be pursued with both strength and integrity. As the echo of that declaration continued to reverberate across television panels and digital timelines, the investigation itself did not pause for political shockwaves. Instead, it intensified quietly, methodically, almost surgically, because while bold words dominate headlines, it is disciplined action that ultimately determines outcomes. And behind closed doors, investigators were reconstructing the final known hours of Nancy Guthrie's movements, analyzing entry points, reviewing neighborhood camera angles frame by frame, and mapping behavioral patterns of the masked individual seen near her residence, knowing that every second captured on video could carry disproportionate weight in a case now charged not only with emotional urgency, but with the added gravity of presidential attention. Inside briefing rooms, officials understood that high-profile rhetoric changes the atmosphere of an investigation. It elevates stakes, sharpens scrutiny, and compresses timelines under public pressure. Yet professionals trained in crisis response know that speed without precision can fracture a case before it reaches court. So while the nation debated capital punishment and moral accountability, forensic teams focused on the tangible: fingerprints, fibers, electronic data trails, cell tower pings, vehicle movement logs, because ultimately justice is built not on declarations, but on evidence that can withstand challenge, cross-examination, and the relentless standards of due process. The emotional climate surrounding the case deepened as well, because when leadership signals the possibility of the harshest penalty available under federal law, it intensifies both hope and fear simultaneously. Hope that the system is prepared to act decisively, and fear that the circumstances may indeed be as grave as implied, and that duality creates a psychological pressure point for families, communities, and even potential suspects, as the narrative shifts from uncertainty toward a looming reckoning that feels closer, heavier, more consequential with each passing hour. Political analysts began dissecting the implications of the statement, noting that such direct references to the death penalty in an active disappearance case are rare and strategically loaded, reflecting a broader philosophy on law enforcement and accountability. Yet beyond partisan interpretation lies a simpler human reaction. When an elderly woman vanishes under suspicious conditions, society instinctively demands protection for the vulnerable and consequences for those who exploit that vulnerability. And the president's words appeared to channel that instinct into a forceful message designed to resonate beyond legal nuance and into moral clarity. At the same time, seasoned legal observers reminded viewers that even in cases that ultimately involve the most severe charges, the justice system moves through defined stages: identification of suspects, collection of admissible evidence, grand jury proceedings, formal indictments, and none of these can be bypassed by emotion or political pressure, which means the real story unfolding behind the scenes is one of patience and rigor, where investigators must balance urgency with restraint, ensuring that every piece of the puzzle aligns cohesively before any prosecutorial step is taken. There's also a strategic dimension that cannot be overlooked. Public warnings of severe punishment can serve as psychological leverage, particularly if those responsible are monitoring media coverage, because awareness that the highest levels of government are watching may alter behavior, disrupt planning, or increase the likelihood of mistakes. And in crisis scenarios, even small behavioral shifts can generate new leads, new digital footprints, or new witness accounts that tip the investigative balance in unexpected ways. Ultimately, this chapter of the case is defined by tension between rhetoric and reality, between public demand and procedural discipline, between moral outrage and legal standards. And as the story continues to unfold, what matters most is not the volume of declarations, but the integrity of the process that follows, because justice, especially in cases charged with national emotion, must be pursued with clarity, evidence, and unwavering commitment to truth. And while the president's words have undeniably raised the stakes, the outcome will depend on the quiet, relentless work of those determined to transform uncertainty into accountability through facts rather than fury. The air around the case thickened with anticipation as investigators dug deeper, because each new lead, each small discovery, carried amplified significance under the national spotlight. Neighborhood witnesses were interviewed multiple times, every detail cross-checked, and surveillance footage painstakingly analyzed, because in high-stakes situations like this, even the smallest anomaly, a shadow, a reflection, a fleeting figure, can become pivotal, and the presence of the president's warning cast a long, tense shadow over the operation, heightening urgency without compromising precision. The masked figure captured near Nancy Guthrie's home became more than a blurry image. It was a symbol of everything at stake, a visual anchor for both public anxiety and investigative focus, and every potential match to that figure's movements was pursued with exhaustive rigor. Behind closed doors, the tactical and analytical teams were coordinating across multiple agencies, understanding that the pressure of national attention could influence behavior in unexpected ways. For suspects, it was a warning. Misstep now could carry irreversible consequences. For investigators, the challenge was to remain methodical, to avoid confirmation bias, to let evidence guide decisions rather than speculation or the intensity of headlines. Every interview, every forensic sample, every time-stamped video frame became a building block of a narrative that demanded accuracy, even as it unfolded under intense public scrutiny. Meanwhile, the psychological impact of the president's declaration rippled outward. Families, neighbors, and online audiences debated not only the morality of invoking the death penalty in a missing person case, but also the broader implications for justice and deterrence. Social media became a theater for speculation, opinion, and emotion, and journalists covered every angle, aware that this case had transitioned from local tragedy to national spectacle. In this environment, the narrative was not just what law enforcement discovered, but also what the public perceived. A dynamic where perception and reality intertwined in complex, sometimes unpredictable ways. Investigators also had to contend with the complexity of human behavior. Masked suspects, possible accomplices, and onlookers all introduce variables, and understanding motives, fear responses, and decision-making patterns became a strategic component of the operation. Criminal profiling, combined with forensic evidence, digital footprints, and neighborhood patterns, created a multi-dimensional map of possibilities, each hypothesis carefully tested against facts rather than assumption. The stakes were more than legal, they were moral, social, and emotional, and the pressure was magnified because every moment without resolution reinforced national concern. For law enforcement, the addition of federal visibility transformed routine investigative procedures into high-pressure operations where timing, coordination, and discretion became essential. The president's public statements did not dictate method, but they added a layer of accountability that underscored the importance of rapid, careful action. The narrative shifted. Investigators were not merely solving a local disappearance. They were navigating a national crisis with legal, political, and public dimensions where success required balancing speed with meticulous attention to detail. Simultaneously, the media landscape amplified every development. Headlines, analysis, and televised updates shaped public understanding in real time. Every discovery, every tentative lead was filtered through lenses of urgency, morality, and political interpretation. The challenge for both law enforcement and journalists was maintaining clarity, separating verified evidence from rumor, speculation from fact, emotion from objective analysis. The case demanded nuanced communication to avoid missteps, misperceptions, or overreach that could compromise outcomes or inflame public anxiety. Ultimately, Part 3 of this saga underscores a critical lesson. In high-stakes, high-visibility investigations, the combination of political statements, public scrutiny, and meticulous investigative work creates a tension that defines the trajectory of the case. The president's warning intensified scrutiny, accelerated urgency, and elevated stakes, but it did not replace the careful, systematic work required to locate Nancy Guthrie safely and hold accountable those responsible. In this delicate balance, every decision, every piece of evidence, and every strategic action carries weight, and the unfolding narrative remains a compelling study of justice, consequence, and human response under extraordinary pressure. By the time news outlets began circulating updates on the case, the tension in the community had reached a fever pitch because each new detail, a possible lead, a sighting, or an unverified claim, carried enormous emotional weight. Neighbors, family, friends, and even casual observers were drawn into a vortex of hope and fear. And law enforcement understood that public pressure could either help or hinder progress. Investigators moved carefully, knowing that any premature disclosure could alert potential suspects, compromise evidence, or mislead the public. but they also recognized that transparency in measured doses helped maintain community cooperation and trust, a delicate balancing act that required both strategic foresight and psychological acuity. Inside the command centers, analysts pored over every element of digital evidence: doorbell cameras, neighborhood security systems, cell phone records, and social media activity were cross-referenced with known timelines and suspect behavior patterns. Every pixel, timestamp, and anomaly was scrutinized for its potential to reveal the unknown figure's movements or identity. The pressure was immense. Not only was the public watching, but the president's statement had added a layer of urgency that created a palpable sense of consequence, reminding everyone involved that the stakes were national, legal, and profoundly personal. Meanwhile, in households across the city, the story became more than a news item. It became a shared experience of suspense and moral judgment. Discussions in living rooms and online forums revolved around justice, punishment, and empathy for Nancy Guthrie's family. The president's call for the most severe penalties if she were harmed catalyzed these discussions, turning speculation into moral debate. How far should consequences extend? What is the role of public pressure in law enforcement? And crucially, how does society balance emotional outrage with the principles of due process? These questions reflected the broader societal tension embedded within the case. Investigative teams also faced the challenge of reconciling the emotional tone of the public narrative with methodical scientific analysis. Glove prints, DNA fragments, shoe impressions, and other physical evidence required meticulous cataloging and testing. While news coverage highlighted dramatic possibilities, the reality was painstakingly incremental, a reminder that forensic breakthroughs often emerge slowly, not explosively. Every sample had to be preserved perfectly, every chain of custody strictly maintained, because even the smallest oversight could compromise a case of national attention. The psychological pressure on investigators and law enforcement personnel was immense. They were acutely aware that any misstep could have consequences far beyond procedural setbacks, from public criticism to potential legal complications. The president's declaration added symbolic weight to each decision. Investigators knew the world was watching, and every choice carried amplified significance, magnifying both accountability and risk. This environment demanded not only technical skill, but also emotional resilience, strategic patience, and unwavering focus. Public statements from officials and law enforcement agencies aimed to reassure while maintaining investigative integrity. Carefully worded updates balanced transparency with discretion, providing essential information without compromising ongoing operations. These communications served multiple functions. They informed the public, maintained trust, and strategically managed the narrative to avoid panic or misdirection, all while under the glare of national scrutiny heightened by executive commentary. In sum, Part 4 demonstrates that behind the sensational headlines lies a complex interplay of evidence, emotion, strategy, and public perception. The president's statements elevated the stakes, but real progress depended on methodical, disciplined, and often unseen work that combined forensics, intelligence analysis, and tactical operations. Every lead investigated, every question asked, and every piece of evidence processed became part of a larger story of accountability, urgency, and human determination, a story that continues to unfold with each passing hour, keeping the nation both informed and riveted. As the investigation advanced, new developments began to surface that both energized and perplexed the team, because evidence recovered from near Nancy Guthrie's home suggested patterns that required careful interpretation rather than immediate assumptions. The discovery of gloves, fibers, and other seemingly mundane items became charged symbols of progress, each artifact a potential key to unraveling the mystery. Analysts examined every microscopic detail, measuring, comparing, and cross-referencing against known databases, because in cases of this magnitude, even a small discrepancy or overlooked element can pivot the course of an entire investigation. Meanwhile, the local community was a pressure cooker of emotion. Neighbors, friends, and acquaintances followed each update with anxious eyes, sharing theories and hopes in hushed conversations and social media threads alike. Public sentiment oscillated between fear, outrage, and cautious optimism, with the president's earlier remarks amplifying these emotions as citizens grappled with the intersection of legal process and moral expectation. The investigation, while grounded in facts and procedure, was also a story of human tension, where every decision made behind closed doors reverberated through living rooms, comment sections, and newsrooms nationwide. Law enforcement personnel navigated the challenge of high-profile scrutiny with discipline. Tactical teams coordinated with forensic experts to ensure that every step taken was both strategic and legally sound. Surveillance footage was painstakingly reviewed, patterns of movement reconstructed, and potential witnesses re-interviewed. The masked figure near Guthrie's residence was now not just an image on tape, but a puzzle to decode. A silhouette carrying the weight of multiple investigative avenues, requiring a blend of deductive reasoning, forensic precision, and experience under pressure. At the same time, experts in criminal behavior highlighted how public statements, especially those from influential figures, could indirectly affect suspects. Heightened media attention and national declarations of consequences could provoke mistakes, elicit new leads, or even force those responsible into hiding. Investigators understood the psychological dynamics at play, leveraging the heightened awareness without letting it compromise operational discretion. The subtle interplay between public pressure and criminal psychology became an essential factor in shaping strategy and guiding decision-making. Behind the scenes, agencies collaborated across jurisdictions, connecting dots that might otherwise remain isolated. Data sharing, joint interviews, and synchronized timelines ensured that no clue was lost in the shuffle of high-profile attention. The focus was on actionable intelligence. What could lead investigators to Nancy Guthrie safely? What could identify the masked figure? And what could establish accountability for any accomplices involved? This meticulous orchestration emphasized that success depended on coordination, precision, and patience, qualities often invisible to the public, yet vital for effective outcomes. Journalists and analysts continued dissecting developments, noting how the narrative evolved with each recovered artifact, witness statement, and media update. Discussions ranged from forensic breakthroughs to policy implications, examining the broader societal and legal questions raised by such a high-profile disappearance. The balance between factual reporting and audience engagement became delicate. Journalists had to inform, contextualize, and maintain credibility without sensationalizing or compromising ongoing investigative efforts. Ultimately, Part 5 underscores the convergence of multiple dimensions: investigative rigor, public expectation, psychological strategy, and national attention. Every recovered glove, every traced movement, every analysis contributes not just to solving the case, but to understanding how complex, high-stakes situations unfold in real time. The president's statements added urgency, but the real work, measured, calculated, and relentless, continued quietly behind the scenes, shaping the trajectory of an investigation that captured the nation's attention and tested the limits of strategy, resilience, and determination. As the investigation reached critical stages, every new development seemed to carry the weight of history, because now the case was no longer merely a local disappearance. It had become a national test of law enforcement precision, public patience, and moral clarity. Teams worked around the clock, piecing together timelines, mapping movements, and analyzing forensic evidence, each element layered with meaning, each discovery a potential breakthrough in a puzzle that demanded perfection. The president's prior statements about the most severe consequences had elevated expectations to near fever pitch, and every decision, every lead was scrutinized both internally and externally for its potential impact on outcomes. The emotional intensity surrounding the case had reached an apex. Families, neighbors, and even casual observers experienced a collective tension caught between hope for a safe return and fear of tragic outcomes. The masked figure, the recovered glove, and the carefully traced footprints all created a narrative arc that was simultaneously frightening and compelling. The nation watched, discussions surged online, and every update carried symbolic weight. Law enforcement understood that in addition to tangible evidence, public perception itself had become a critical component, shaping cooperation, tips, and even the psychological environment in which potential suspects operated. Behind closed doors, investigative teams focused relentlessly on patterns: foot traffic, digital footprints, behavioral profiling, and environmental analysis, all merged into a comprehensive picture designed to anticipate suspect actions and locate Nancy Guthrie safely. Each minute of analysis was meticulously cross-checked, every anomaly scrutinized for relevance. The work was painstaking, methodical, and unglamorous, yet it was the backbone of progress. The quiet engine behind the headlines, the disciplined counterpoint to the explosive statements that had captured public attention. As the public watched the unfolding drama, journalists and analysts continued to break down the implications of every discovery, emphasizing the tension between immediate action and procedural integrity. The gloves found, potential video matches, and evidence trails became focal points for discussion. But the real story remained the investigative process itself, how methodical examination, strategic thinking, and legal precision converged to solve a case with national implications. The president's comments amplified attention, but did not replace the work required to ensure justice, safety, and accountability. In parallel, psychologists and crisis management experts weighed in, highlighting the behavioral consequences of high-profile declarations. The threat of severe punishment can provoke errors, reveal patterns, or alter decision-making in unpredictable ways. Investigators leverage this knowledge, carefully observing public reactions, potential suspect behavior, and media trends to anticipate and adapt. In high-stakes situations like this, strategy extends beyond the crime scene, encompassing the entire ecosystem of perception, psychology, and communication. Well, community response remained a critical factor, with neighbors providing tips, sharing observations, and offering cooperation that, when combined with evidence and expert analysis, created a multidimensional approach to resolving the case. The balance between public engagement and operational security was delicate. Too much disclosure could compromise outcomes, but too little could erode trust. Law enforcement navigated this terrain with care, using strategic communication to maintain credibility, encourage cooperation, and manage expectations in a case that had become emblematic of both urgency and procedural rigor. Ultimately, Part 6 crystallizes the essence of the investigation: the convergence of urgency, methodical strategy, psychological insight, and national attention. Every artifact, every lead, every carefully coordinated effort contributes to a narrative that is as much about justice and accountability as it is about human resilience and determination. While the president's statements have underscored the gravity of the situation, the outcome hinges on the disciplined, unwavering work of those dedicated to finding Nancy Guthrie safely and holding responsible parties accountable. In the end, it is the combination of evidence, expertise, and ethical rigor that will define success, a reminder that even in moments of extraordinary public drama, methodical action remains the truest path to resolution.